In 1850, no one had ever heard of John D. Rockefeller. In 1860, no one had heard of J.P. Morgan controlling the financial arteries of a continent. In 1870, the Rothschild name was still a regional whisper, not the planetary force it would soon become. By 1900, these families owned the world. That is 50 years, half a century. And in that window, virtually every dynasty that controls global finance, media, energy, and pharmaceutical industries today emerged from obscurity, fully formed, capitalized beyond explanation, with wealth that had no traceable origin story that holds up under scrutiny. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because the timeline does not just tell us who got rich, it tells us what was happening. In the decades right before they did, there was something here before them. Something enormous, something that was erased, and the families that rose to replace it did not build their wealth from nothing. They inherited ruins. This is the story of the richest families on earth, and the civilization they stepped into after the reset. But before we get into the families themselves, we need to establish something. Because this is not a story about envy. It is not about resenting people for having money. This is about a specific anomaly in the historical record. A timing problem, a capital problem, a construction problem. 3 separate categories of evidence that all point to the same conclusion when you lay them side by side. To understand where these dynasties came from, you first have to understand what researchers in the Tartaria space have been documenting for years. The buildings that supposedly took decades to construct somehow appear in cities that were officially frontier wilderness just years before. Photographs from the 1860s and 1870s show architectural complexity that defies the labour and technology of the era. Grand columned halls, vaulted railway terminals, monumental courthouses and post offices in towns that had barely 50 permanent residents. The official explanation is that human beings built all of it in 20 years with horse-drawn carts and hand tools. No power equipment, no cranes, no modern concrete mixing. Just men with wheelbarrows. And alongside that construction miracle, a handful of families were suddenly sitting on incomprehensible fortunes with no coherent explanation for how they accumulated them. Look at the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller Sr. is presented as a self-made industrialist who built Standard Oil from the ground up. The story begins with him as a bookkeeper, then a produce merchant, then an oil refinery co-owner in Cleveland in the 1860s. By 1880, he controlled 90% of all oil refining in the United States. By 1900, his net worth adjusted for today's currency is estimated between $300 and $400 billion. The question that never gets a satisfying answer is, where did the startup capital come from? Who funded the initial refinery? Who extended the credit lines when Standard Oil was buying out competitors at a pace that would have required enormous cash reserves? The bookkeeper origin story does not explain the capital base. It never has. The Morgans are even more instructive. J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was already an international banker operating out of London by the 1850s, deeply connected to European money houses at a time when transatlantic financial infrastructure was supposedly still primitive. J.P. took that foundation and in the span of 30 years reorganized entire American industries, railroads, steel, electricity, telecommunications. He did not just invest, he restructured. He operated as though he had a map of what the American economy was supposed to look like after someone had drawn up the blueprint in advance. And then there are the Rothschilds. The official origin story says Meyer Amschel Rothschild began as a coin dealer in the Frankfurt ghetto in the mid-1700s and built a banking dynasty through 5 sons placed across 5 European capitals. Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Amschel in Frankfurt, Karl in Naples. The story is presented as an act of extraordinary familial coordination. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 50 years, and suddenly the most powerful banking network in Western history. The timeline of their rise from coin dealer to controlling interest in the Bank of England is compressed in a way that stretches credibility when you examine the actual mechanics of 18th and 19th century wealth accumulation. Capital does not travel that fast in a pre-telegraph world. Relationships do not consolidate across 5 sovereign nations in one generation without an existing infrastructure to move through. The Rothschild rise looks less like a family business that grew and more like a family that was handed a pre-existing network and placed into operational control of it. What is consistent across all 3 dynasties, and across the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Warburgs, is that the serious, generational, untouchable wealth appears in concentrated form between approximately 1860 and 1890. The same 30-year window. Now consider what researchers point to as happening in that same window in the physical world. The 1811 New Madrid earthquakes are documented. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora caused what historians call the year without a summer in 1816. Crop failures across the northern hemisphere, famine, social instability, mass migration. The Carrington event of 1859 was a geomagnetic storm so powerful it set telegraph lines on fire and produced auroras visible at the equator. And in 1811 through the 1850s, the fossil record of inhabited land changes in ways that official history attributes to migration and development, but which, when mapped, shows something closer to repopulation. Repopulation, not expansion, repopulation. Cities that should show gradual architectural evolution instead appear almost fully formed in a single photographic era. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago is one of the most studied examples. The buildings erected for that fair, the Court of Honor, the Palace of Fine Arts, the massive neoclassical structures that lined the lagoon, were supposedly designed and built in under 2 years. Contractors working around the clock, hundreds of thousands of workers, steel frames clad in a material called staff, a mixture of cement and fibre. But researchers who have studied the original survey photographs point to details that do not fit a temporary construction project. The basement systems, the infrastructure that ran beneath the grounds, the precision of the stonework in areas that would never be photographed by tourists. It did not look like something built for an 18-month exhibition. It looked like something adapted for one. The same pattern appears in Washington, D.C., in the grand post offices and customs houses that dot American cities, in the train stations of Philadelphia and Cincinnati and St. Louis. These are buildings whose construction timelines, when examined carefully, do not match the official record. And the families who emerged in this same era, they did not just acquire money. They acquired control of the new systems that were built to manage and extract value from populations resettled into a reorganized world. Rockefeller took oil, the energy infrastructure. Morgan took banking and credit, the financial infrastructure. Carnegie took steel, the physical infrastructure. Vanderbilt took railroads, the transport infrastructure. Astor had already locked up land. Each dynasty claimed a different layer of the rebuilt civilization. There is a term researchers use for this, the Great Reset. Not the recent one announced by the World Economic Forum, though the borrowed language is worth noting. The original reset that alternative historians point to is an event, or series of events, somewhere between 1800 and 1860 that depopulated significant portions of the earth, destroyed or buried the physical record of the prior civilization, the one that built those grand structures, and created a vacancy that was then filled by a new administrative class backed by concentrated, unexplained capital. The mud flood theory is one component of this framework. Physical evidence, researchers argue, shows that entire building floors were buried in sediment, ground levels raised, window wells dug out after the fact. Photographs show buildings whose first floors are inexplicably below street grade in cities that have no official record of flooding or burial events. Door frames that begin underground. Basement arches that were clearly once the ground floor entrance. Walk through the old districts of any major American city built before 1880, and you will find this pattern if you know what you're looking for. Buildings where the ornamentation is richest at the level that is now a basement. Cornices and carved stonework on what is now an underground facade. In some cities, entire underground street networks exist beneath the current grade. Seattle's Underground being the most publicly acknowledged example. though the official explanation attributes it to a fire and subsequent rebuilding rather than a gradual burial event. The infrastructure beneath cities tells a different story than the infrastructure above them, and the families who showed up to claim all of it never had to explain why the ground floor was already underground when they arrived. The people walking into their banking positions and oil deals in the 1860s were not building on empty land. They were walking into a partially cleared, partially buried, fully vacated infrastructure, and they were given the titles and the charters and the financial instruments to claim it as their own. Where did the prior population go? That question sits at the centre of the Tartaria research community. The absence of bodies, the absence of transition, the genealogical dead ends that appear in family trees across North America and Europe around the same period. Census records that begin, not continue. Church registries that start, not resume. The families that emerge to rule the post-reset world share certain characteristics beyond their wealth. They are deeply interconnected through marriage, through shared banking relationships, through the same network of private clubs and institutions that began forming in the 1860s and 1870s. The Pilgrim Society, the Council on Foreign Relations, which would come later, but whose founding membership overlaps almost completely with the second-generation heirs of the original wealth families. The Bank for International Settlements, established 1930, which exists outside the legal jurisdiction of any nation on earth, originally to manage German reparation payments, but which quickly became the central node of the global banking network. You do not build infrastructure like that in 2 generations. You inherit it. You inherit the relationships, the instruments, the templates. Someone designed this system. The families visible to us are custodians, not architects. The custodian role is important to understand. A custodian does not need to know the full history of what they are managing. They only need to know the rules, how to operate the systems they were handed, how to pass them to the next generation intact. The bootstrap mythology, the self-made stories, serve the custodian perfectly. If people believe you built it, they never ask who built it before you. They never ask about the gap. They never look at the 30-year window and ask why every major dynasty on earth planted its flag at exactly the same moment in the same era of supposed primitive industrial development. And that may be the most important thing to understand about the richest dynasties on earth. Their public-facing history, the bootstrap stories, the self-made industrialist narratives, the rags-to-railroad baron arcs, those are administrative legends, stories constructed to explain the presence of capital that arrived fully formed into a world that had just been emptied and reset. The real origin of that wealth is the same origin as the grand buildings that appear without a credible construction timeline. The same origin as the cities that materialize in the photographic record without a coherent settlement sequence. The same origin as the infrastructure that was already in place when the first settlers of the official record arrived. Consider also the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an organization called the Children's Aid Society transported an estimated 250,000 children, labeled as orphans and street children from New York, west across the country, placing them with farming families across the frontier. The scale of that program has never been adequately explained by the street child problem of a single city. Researchers who look at those numbers against the backdrop of the reset ask a different question. Where did all those children actually come from? Were they orphans from a prior civilization's collapse? Children whose parents died or disappeared in events the new historical record never acknowledged? Official history calls in a humanitarian movement. The timing, the scale, and the systematic distribution of unclaimed children across a continent that was simultaneously being repopulated and rebranded sits uncomfortably alongside every other anomaly of the same era. It came from before, from whatever was here before the reset. From the civilization that researchers have spent years trying to name, reconstruct, and understand, the one referred to, however imperfectly, as Tartaria. The families did not create the new world. They claimed what was left of the old one. They renamed it, repapered it, refinanced it, and then they wrote the history books that taught every subsequent generation that they had built it from scratch. That story is collapsing. not because of any single piece of evidence, but because of the weight of the pattern, the timeline, the convergence, the architecture that defies the labour capacity of the era it supposedly came from, the simultaneous emergence of dynasties across continents, all staking claims to the same moment of transition, all tracing their untraceable fortunes back to the same 30-year window when, according to the official record, the modern world began. It did not begin, it resumed, under new management. And the question that keeps getting louder, the one that more and more researchers are refusing to let go of, is not whether a prior civilization existed. The buildings answer that question on their own. The question is, who decided which families got to inherit it?